The woman at the door looked at him the way people looked at things that did not fit the picture they had been expecting. It was not a long look. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which was long enough to be a look and short enough to be deniable as one. Her eyes moved from his face to his jacket to his daughter and back to her clipboard, and in that movement something had been decided that had nothing to do with the clipboard. His name was Samuel Okafor. He was 42 years old, wearing a dark brown leather jacket over a black crewneck, dark trousers, and boots that were good but did not announce themselves. He was holding the hand of his 10-year-old daughter, Naya, who was wearing a burgundy dress she had chosen herself and had been talking about for 3 days, and who was currently looking past the woman at the door at the interior of the venue with the specific expression of someone who had arrived at a place they had been, imagining and was comparing the imagination to the reality. The reality was considerable. The venue was a converted warehouse in the garment district that had been transformed for the evening into something that bore almost no resemblance to a warehouse. The entrance alone, where they were standing, had been dressed with arrangements of white flowers and low-directional lighting that made the space feel like the beginning of something rather than a door. Inside, visible through the open entrance, a runway ran the full length of the room, flanked by seating on both sides. The whole thing lit with the specific precision of people who understood that light was not a neutral thing and had opinions about what it should do. Nia was looking at the flowers. She was the kind of child who noticed flowers. The woman with the clipboard, whose name was Genevieve, and who had been managing front of house at events like this for 8 years, said, "Good evening." "Your names, please?" Samuel said Okafor. Samuel Okafor. Genevieve looked at her clipboard. She looked at it with the focused attention of someone who was going to find the name if it was there, and was already preparing for the possibility that it was not. She looked at it for a moment that was slightly longer than searching required. She said, "I'm not seeing an Okafor on the list. Do you have your invitation?" Samuel said, "I don't have a physical invitation. I was notified through my office." Genevieve said, "We require either a physical invitation or a digital confirmation for entry. It's a closed event." She said this with the smooth, practiced delivery of a policy that had been delivered many times and was expected to be sufficient. Samuel said, "I understand. Could you check the owner's guest list? My name may be listed there separately." Genevieve's expression adjusted in the small way that expressions adjusted when something unexpected had been introduced into a conversation that was supposed to be simple. She said, "The owner's list is handled through our creative director's office. I don't have access to it from here." Samuel said, "Could someone check it?" Genevieve said, "I can make a call. But our door policy is firm until I receive confirmation." She said this with the gentle finality of someone who was not going to move from her position without external authorization, which was a reasonable policy and a reasonable position and was producing, in this specific instance, an unreasonable result. Nia had turned from the flowers. She was looking at the exchange with the particular attention of a 10-year-old who understood that something was happening between the adults and was assessing it. She said, "Daddy, are the flowers inside too?" Samuel looked at his daughter. He said, "I expect so. We're going to find out." Nia looked at the flowers at the entrance and then at Genevieve and then at her father with the expression of a child who was waiting to see how the situation resolved before deciding what to feel about it. Genevieve made the call. It was brief. She said 2 things and listened for 15 seconds and said one more thing and ended the call. Then she looked at Samuel with an expression that had shifted from the smooth management of a policy into something less certain, the expression of someone who had received information that changed the shape of the situation, but not in a way that was yet fully clear to her. She said, "Someone will be out in a moment. Could you wait just here?" Samuel said, "Of course." They waited at the entrance of the fashion show that was taking place in a brand Samuel owned. He had purchased Aural, the luxury fashion house whose spring collection was currently being prepared to walk the runway 30 feet from where he was standing. 22 months ago, through a holding company that had handled the acquisition without his name being prominent in the public record. He had done this because the acquisition had been strategic, and the strategy required a period of quiet ownership during which the brand stabilized under new direction without the disruption of a public change of ownership narrative. He had planned to make the ownership more visible after the first full season under his stewardship. This was the first full season. Tonight was the show. He had come tonight with Nia because Nia had a specific and long-standing interest in fashion that had been evident since she was 6 years old and had begun to make her own color decisions about her clothing with the authoritative confidence of someone who had strong views and was not interested in deferring them. He had been bringing her to fashion events for 2 years. This one was different because the brand presenting tonight was his, and he had wanted her to see that. He had not announced his attendance through official channels because he did not make his attendance at his own events into announcements. He had communicated through his office, which had communicated through the appropriate internal channel, and somewhere in that chain a communication had not arrived at the clipboard Genevieve was holding. A woman appeared from the interior of the venue. She was in her early 40s, moving with the specific energy of someone who was managing 15 things and had just been handed a 16th that was potentially of a different order than the other 15. She was dressed with the precise intentionality of someone who worked in fashion and understood that how you dressed for an event like this was a professional statement. Her name was Dominique Marché, and she was the creative director of Aurel, and she had been in that role for 6 years, through the previous ownership and now into the current one, and she had met Samuel Okafor once, 6 weeks ago, in a meeting room that had involved lawyers and documents and a conversation about the brand's creative direction that had lasted 4 hours and been one of the more substantial conversations of her professional life. She had not expected to encounter him at the door of her show. She came out and saw him and stopped for a moment. That was less than a second, but was visible. And then she continued forward and said, "Mr. Okafor," in a tone that was composed and genuine and carrying the specific quality of a person who understood immediately what had happened and was deciding how to address it. Samuel said, "Dominique," she said, "I'm sorry. There was a failure in how the communication was handled internally. It's being addressed right now." She said it with the directness of someone who had decided that the most useful thing she could do in this moment was to name the failure precisely and without decoration. Samuel said, "I understand. It happens." She looked at Nia. She said, "You must be Nia." Nia looked at her with the frank assessment she applied to most new adults. She said yes. She said it with the formal courtesy she used when she was reserving judgment. Dominique said, "Your father told me about you. He said you have very strong opinions about color." Nia looked at her father briefly, the quick confirmatory glance of a child checking whether something has been said about them accurately. Then she looked at Dominique and said, "Yes. Most people use color wrong." Dominique looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Samuel. She said, "She's going to love the collection." Samuel said, "That's what I'm hoping." Dominique gestured toward the entrance. She said, "Please come in." They walked in through the entrance, and the flowers that Nia had been looking at were the first of many flowers, and the room inside was everything the entrance had promised, and then something more. Nia stopped inside the threshold and looked at the runway, and the lighting and the arrangement of seats and the scale of the room, and then she looked at the flowers that lined the runway edges in low arrangements of white and deep green, and she said, quietly and entirely to herself, "That's right." Samuel heard her. He said, "What's right?" She said, "The flowers. They're white, but the stems are showing. Most people would hide the stems. These ones let the stems show." She pointed with one finger, the specific pointing of a child indicating something precise. "It makes the flowers look like they're growing there, not like they were put there." Samuel looked at the floral arrangement. He had approved the concept in a brief with the event designer 4 weeks ago. He had approved it because it felt right without being able to articulate exactly why it felt right. He understood now exactly why it felt right. He said, "I noticed that too." Nia looked at him. She said, "You approved it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good call." He said, "Thank you." She returned to her inventory of the room with the systematic pleasure of someone who had arrived somewhere that was meeting the standard she had brought with her. Dominique walked with them to their seats, which were in the front row on the left side. the position that Samuel had specified in his original attendance communication because he had wanted Nia to have the closest possible view of the work. Nia sat down and immediately began looking at everything she could see from this position, which was all of it. Dominique sat with them for a moment before the show began. She looked at Samuel with the expression of someone who had a professional question and had decided this was the right time to ask it. She said, "I want to understand something about tonight," he said. "Ask," she said. "You came without announcing yourself formally. You came through a channel that didn't produce a flag at the door. You let yourself be stopped at the entrance of your own show rather than call me directly from the car when you arrived." She paused. "Why?" Samuel looked at the runway. He thought about how to answer that honestly. He said, "Because if I call ahead and announce myself, the show I see is the show that knows it's being watched." He looked at Dominique. "I've owned this brand for 22 months. I need to see what it actually is, not what it is when it's performing for the owner." Dominique held his gaze. She said, "And what did you see at the door?" He said, "A policy being applied consistently by someone doing her job correctly, and a communication failure somewhere internal that I'm going to want to understand." She said, "That's a generous reading." He said, "It's an accurate reading." Genevieve did exactly what she should have done. "The failure was in how my attendance was communicated." "That's not her problem." "It's ours," Dominique said. "I've already asked Renata to trace the communication chain. We'll know where it broke by tomorrow morning." Samuel said, "Good." She said, "Can I ask you something else?" He said, "Go ahead." She said, "If the communication hadn't failed, if Genevieve had found your name on the list and waved you through immediately, would tonight have been different?" Samuel thought about this honestly. He said, "The show would have been the same." He paused. "What I would have missed is what I saw in those few minutes at the door." She said, "What did you see?" He said, "A team that holds the line even when the line is uncomfortable to hold." Genevieve didn't make an exception for someone who told her he was connected to ownership. She held the policy and made the call and waited for authorization. "That's exactly what you want the person at your door to do." Dominique looked at him for a moment. She said, "That's not what most owners would take from that experience." He said, "Most owners aren't looking at the same thing I'm looking at." She said, "What are you looking at?" He said, "Whether the thing I bought is what I thought it was. Whether the values I believed were in the brand are actually in the people who run it, or whether they're just in the marketing materials." Dominique said, "And?" Samuel said, "The jury is still deliberating." He looked at her. "But tonight is evidence." Nia had been listening to this conversation with the attentiveness she brought to adult conversations worth following. She had not appeared to be listening. She had appeared to be studying the lighting rig above the runway with focused interest. She was doing both because she was 10 and could do both. And she filed the conversation in the place where she filed things that were going to matter later. She said, without turning from the lighting rig, "What does the brand make?" Dominique looked at her. She said, "Clothing, luxury ready to wear and some bespoke pieces." Nia said, "What makes it luxury?" Dominique said, "The materials, the construction, the attention to how something is made rather than just what it looks like when it's finished." Nia said, "Like the flowers." Dominique looked at the runway edge flowers, the white blooms with the stems showing. She looked at Nia. She said, "Yes, exactly like the flowers." Nia nodded. She said, "Then it's real luxury, not the kind that just looks expensive. The kind that is expensive because of what went into it." Dominique looked at Samuel. Something moved through her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but lived in the territory between them. Samuel said, "She's been doing this since she was 6, Dominique said. "She's better at it than most people I work with," Nia said. "That's because most people are looking at the finished thing. I look at the decisions, the lights dimmed." A murmur moved through the room in the specific way that murmurs moved through rooms when the thing everyone had come for was about to begin. Nia sat up slightly in her seat with the focused readiness of someone who had been waiting for this and was now prepared to give it everything. The first look came down the runway. Nia did not make a sound. She watched with both hands in her lap and her chin slightly raised, and the expression of someone who was receiving information and processing it simultaneously. running it through whatever internal framework she had developed over 4 years of caring about this with her whole self. Samuel watched his daughter watch the show. He had built things his entire adult life. Companies, acquisitions, portfolios, brands. He had built them quietly, without his name on the front of them where strangers could see it. Without the kind of visibility that invited the wrong kind of attention, and that seemed to him to be in fundamental tension with the actual work of building. He had built them from the understanding, arrived at early and never revised, that what mattered was what the thing was, not who was known to own it. He had bought Aurel because Aurel was a brand that understood what it was making and why. Because the clothes moved through the world with the specific quality of things made by people who cared about the decisions rather than just the outcome. Because when he had sat with the previous ownership and looked at the collection and talked about what the brand was for, the answers had been the right answers, and he had trusted the rightness of them. He was sitting in the front row of the first show under his ownership, watching his daughter watch the clothes come down the runway, and her face was telling him more about the collection than any review would tell him, because she was looking at the decisions and had been looking at decisions since she was 6 and did not know how to look at anything else. The third look came down and Nia made a small sound. Not a loud sound, not a public sound, just the involuntary small sound of a person whose internal assessment has been confirmed by something they are looking at. Samuel heard it. He said quietly, "Which part?" She said, "The collar. It goes all the way up, but it's not stiff. It moves like it's soft, but it looks structured. That's really hard to do." Samuel looked at the collar as the model passed. He did not have the vocabulary to evaluate what Nia had just described. He did not need the vocabulary. He had the daughter. He said, "Is that good?" She said, "It's excellent." He said, "Good." She went back to watching with the expression of someone who had delivered a verdict and was moving to the next item. The show lasted 40 minutes. Nia watched every second of it with the unbroken attention she brought to things she cared about, which was the most honest form of endorsement Samuel knew how to recognize. She did not look at her phone. She did not whisper to him about things unrelated to what was on the runway. She watched the clothes come down in the order that Dominique and her team had assembled them, and she received each one with the full weight of her attention. When the final look came down and the designer came out to the end of the runway and the room filled with applause, Nia clapped. She clapped with the specific quality of someone who meant it rather than someone who was participating in a social gesture, and Samuel heard the difference and noted it. After the applause and the movement of people rising from seats and the specific post-show atmosphere of an event that had gone well and knew it, Dominique came back to where they were standing. She looked at Samuel first, and then at Nia. She said to Nia, "What did you think?" Nia said, "The collar on the third look is the best thing in the collection, but the sixth look has a problem." Dominique's expression moved through several things very quickly. She said, "What problem?" Nia said, "The hem is slightly uneven at the back left. You can't see it from here, but when she turned at the end of the runway, I could see it catch the light differently than the right side." Dominique looked at Samuel. Samuel said nothing. Dominique said to Nia, "You saw that from the front row?" Nia said, "I was looking at the decisions. The hem is a decision. It was slightly wrong." Dominique said, "You're right. We caught it in the final fitting and thought we had corrected it. Apparently not fully." Nia said, "The collar on the third look makes up for it." Dominique said, "I'll tell the team." She looked at Nia with the expression of someone who had encountered something they had not expected to encounter and was deciding what to do with it. She said, "Would you like to see the collection up close, after the guests clear out?" Nia looked at her father with the look that meant she was asking permission without saying the words. Samuel said, "If Dominique has time." Dominique said, "I have time." They spent 45 minutes in the empty runway space after the guests had cleared. Dominique walking Nia through 8 of the collection pieces, explaining the construction decisions, the material choices, the specific problems that each piece had required solving. Nia listened to all of it and asked questions that pressed on the places where the explanation was not complete, and Dominique answered them with the respect of someone who had recognized that the questions were real and deserved real answers. Samuel stood to one side and watched his daughter move through the empty runway space in her burgundy dress, asking the questions that went directly to the decisions. And he thought about what he had come here to see tonight. He had come to see whether the brand he had bought was what he thought it was, whether the values he had seen in it were real or performed, whether the people running it were the right people or the right-looking people. He was standing in the answer to those questions. Dominique walked them out at the end of the evening through the same entrance where they had stood 40 minutes before the show. The flowers were still there, the white blooms with the stems showing exactly right. Nia stopped at the flowers again. She looked at them for a moment. She said, "I want to remember how these are arranged," Dominique said. "I can send you a photograph." Nia looked at her. She said, "Yes, please." Dominique took out her phone and photographed the arrangement and sent it to the number Samuel provided. And Nia received the photograph and looked at it on the phone screen and then looked at the actual flowers and nodded once with the satisfaction of someone who had documented something worth keeping. They walked out into the evening. The garment district was quieter now than it had been when they arrived. The show crowd dispersed into the city. Nia walked beside her father with her hand in his and the expression of someone who was still inside the evening, still turning it over. She said, "Daddy?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "You own that?" He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "All of it? The clothes and the runway and the flowers?" He said, "The brand." "Yes." She thought about this. She said, "Why don't people know?" He said, "Because I didn't need them to know. I needed to know whether the brand was what I thought it was. And I needed to see that without everyone performing for the owner." She said, "Like tonight." "At the door," he said. "Like tonight," she said. "And is it what you thought it was?" He thought about Dominique's directness, about Genevieve holding the line correctly, about the collar on the third look, about his daughter standing in the empty runway space asking the questions that went to the decisions. He said, "Yes, it is." Nia nodded. She said, "Good, because I want to come to the next show." He said, "You will." She said, "And the one after." He said, "And the one after." She said, "Can I bring Kezia?" Kezia was her best friend, who had opinions about clothing that Nia considered worth consulting. Samuel said, "We'll bring Kezia." Nia looked satisfied. She walked beside him through the quiet garment district street and said nothing further for a long time, which meant she was still inside the evening and had not yet finished with it, which was the way she was with things she had given her full attention to. He had given things his full attention his entire life. Every acquisition, every brand, every building and company and conversation that had built into the life he was now living, quietly and without announcement, with his daughter walking beside him and the city going about its business around them. Some things you built with your name on the front. Some things you built with your name in the paperwork and the thing itself forward, and you waited and you watched. And you found out over time whether the thing was what you had believed it was when you decided to build. The flowers had been exactly right. That was enough for tonight. That was always enough. The photograph arrived in Nia's phone at 7:43 the following morning. She was at the kitchen table eating breakfast when it came, and she picked up the phone and looked at the photograph of the flowers, the white blooms with the stems showing, and she looked at it for a long time before she set the phone down and finished her cereal. Samuel was at the counter with his coffee. He said, "Good photograph?" Nia said, "Very good." She looked at the phone again. She said, "Can I write to Dominique?" He said, "What do you want to write?" She said, "I want to tell her about the hem on the sixth look, what I think happened, and how I would fix it." Samuel looked at his daughter. He said, "You have a theory about how it happened?" She said, "The fabric has a slight bias on that side. You can see it in how the light hits it differently. If you cut it on the true grain instead of slightly off, it won't pull." She said this with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone stating a thing they know rather than proposing a thing they suspect. Samuel said, "How do you know about cutting on the grain?" She said, "I've been reading about it." He said, "Since when?" She said, "Since the show where I saw a dress do that at the hem and I wanted to understand why." Samuel set down his coffee. He looked at his daughter eating her cereal and talking about bias, grain and cutting technique with the casual certainty of someone who had been reading about it on her own initiative and had arrived at conclusions she was confident in. He thought about what Dominique had said. She's better at it than most people I work with. He said, I'll give you Dominique's email. Nia said thank you. She went back to her cereal. Then she said, can I also tell her what I think about the collar on the third look? What made it work? He said, you can tell her whatever you think is worth saying. She said, all of it is worth saying. He said, then tell her all of it. She nodded. She finished her cereal. She picked up her phone and began composing an email to the creative director of a luxury fashion house at age 10 on a Wednesday morning about grain and bias and the specific decisions that separated clothing that was excellent from clothing that was merely expensive. Samuel watched her and thought about decisions.